So we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you everyone for joining us today. This session is about becoming a successful applicant for research and clinical programs. Thank you to our panelists for helping us with this. They'll be kind of introducing themselves very briefly here in a little bit, and then we'll go over some prepared questions we have gotten kind of regularly from students in the past, and then we will open it up for any questions that any of you all have. Up first, we have Dr. Levens.
All right, so I'm Dr. Levins, and really happy to be here to tell you a little bit about graduate study and to answer any questions that you have. So, all labs are different depending on the type of research that you do. And I am an experimental psychologist by training. So that means that I will design studies to test the way people process information, the way people process emotions, information, make decisions, uh, the, a wide array of activities, how they interact on social media. So it really varies based upon the research questions that I have. My background is in cognitive and affective behavioral neuroscience. So I used to look at the brain and how it would process information. I would do MRIs and work with individuals that have brain damage, and have since taken that basic research in more sort of applied and purposeful directions in terms of trying to understand the types of decisions people make, how they process emotions in terms of their physical health and mental health, and the way emotion travels across social media. So I sort of look at emotion and cognition within the self, and then the way it flows between individuals in groups, specifically in social media. I am grant active, so which is just basically means I have some grants that fund some of my research. There's not any real difference in terms of the activities that you would do for research if you were grant active or not. You just have someone that you have to report to. So you have a whole other sort of agency that oversees everything. And that is a whole other dynamic in terms of you can, it's, the timing that you would have to take to have to go through everything. You have to sometimes go through additional protocols and regulations and stuff like that. I went to NYU for graduate study, and then I did 6 years of postdoctoral training. So that was one of the pieces that was critical for preparing me for academia. I didn't normally have to do 6 years, but after my first postdoctoral position, that was when the economy crashed, like way back in the first one of 2008. And so they had lots of faculty positions that were dropped, fairly similar to the circumstances that we're in right now. And so I was actually able to continue my studies and get other postdoc positions and prepare myself for my faculty position. I have been here since 2012, and my favorite part of my job is actually mentoring and working with undergraduate and graduate students. So every mentor is different, and we all have different approaches. So one of the really important part of graduate school is actually sort of looking into that mentorship match. And I know we'll probably talk about that a little bit more later on in terms of how to sort of identify pieces of your fit, but that's one that's really important. Sort of know yourself, who you work well with, and ask questions about mentoring style. Reach out to other students. So the number of students I work with varies a great deal based on my projects. So when I had a registered clinical trial about a year and a half to 2 years ago, then I had lots of students in the lab, and this would be undergrads and graduate students. And right now, um, how I have a number of funded projects, and so the number of people that I oversee is more than just what's in my lab. So what's in my lab can really be defined upon the people that are graduate students that are directly in my lab. I'm overseeing their programmatic milestones and undergrads, but then I might, as part of an interdisciplinary team, be training a much wider group of people. So I would basically say that I have anywhere from about 3 to 10 graduate students that I'm working with closely at any one period of time. And that's a pretty wide range. And then I tend, in terms of undergrads, I'll have anywhere from maybe 4 or 5 in shorter, sort of less intensive years, all the way up to 15 And I think one time I had 18. So it really just depends on the projects. Everything sort of fluctuates.
Up next, we have Dr. Galati.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Galati. I'm the principal investigator of the Cognition Interaction Lab. I'm an assistant professor and I have been here since 2018. So I'm at an earlier career stage, if you will, than Dr. Levens, in that I'm working with fewer graduate students at this stage and I'm building capacity in my lab. So I'm at this phase of my career. In my lab, we're studying largely questions that have to do with how cognition unfolds in socially and environmentally situated contexts. So what are the cognitive dynamics during face-to-face, but now also online interaction? And what aspects of coordination among interlocutors make joint action or collaboration work? So a lot of my research program is in that space. I'm also an experimentalist by training. So we design experiments in my lab. Some involve eye tracking, so monitoring the eye fixations of participants working together and what that joint attention reveals about the strategies they deploy in interaction and what these patterns of coordination, how predictive they are of their performance in joint tasks. I use a lot of techniques from discourse analysis. So what happens in dialogue? We code for different things. Sometimes we use automated methods and always take a quantitative approach. So rather than taking ethno-methodological approach, like some conversation analysis or linguists, we do, much like traditional experimental psychologists, doing analysis to see what is predictive of certain patterns of performance or behavior. In part of my work, I'm also interested in how the environment in which we're in guides our memory and our behaviors. So we either manipulate the environments in which people are in the lab, but also use virtual environments or augmented reality environments. So we do have virtual reality in our lab that we use when we're conducting in-person experiments, and use AR, augmented reality technology like the HoloLens, to see how people interact with visual analytics, visual displays, and these external representation of the environment. So we're looking at cognition as distributed among individuals, similar to kind of Dr. Levens' work, and how emotions, let's say, permeate from one person to another, how cognition is distributed among individuals and among their systems in which they are embedded, so their environment. So much of my work is in that space. I am grant seeking at this stage of my career, so I'm in the process of applying for a number of grants, and I have some active grants that we've procured prior to my arrival here, and I'm working with other colleagues in the university on such projects. In terms of number of students, I work with a number of undergraduate arrays, about 3 or 4 per semester. I work with graduate students currently in the Master in Psychology program. And I also occasionally work with summer research scholars through the Charlotte Research Program and programs like SPIDER for students who are underrepresented in science.
Next up, we have Dr. Bennett.
Hi, I'm Dr. Bennett, and my work really focuses at the intersection of biology and psychology. So with regards to the department, I help direct the biobehavioral core lab, which is what I'm standing in right now. And then what that means is that we have the ability to look at physiological markers, so saliva, blood, urine, anything that you can get from a human or animal, if you study animals, and measure what's happening inside their bodies. So that is kind of my strong emphasis, is trying to help connect all the things that Dr. Levins, Dr. Glotti, all my colleagues are doing in the realm of emotion and cognition and behavior and thinking about how humans interact with each other, and kind of rooting that potentially in some type of physiological marker, typically associated with stress and health and those types of things. I'm an associate professor. I've been here since August of 12. And my lab has grown and shrunk and grown and shrunk. So right now we're in a smaller zone just because of the pandemic, as you might expect. That puts restrictions on collecting things from humans with regards to their biology. So we are actually looking to the fall and starting to ramp up and build capacity, because I have 2 dissertations that are ongoing in my lab. That indicates I work with graduate students. I have 4 in my lab directly right now that work with me as a primary mentor. So the cool thing about working with a faculty member who has that kind of world is that you get to see how the next level of training goes. So that's regardless if you go to master's or PhD, there's this kind of idea of community building and the way you learn to do research. Seeing all the different levels is really important. So in my lab, undergrads play a really important role, and really where the rubber meets the ground, because there's a lot of opportunity pre-pandemic and as we move into the fall to really start collecting data again and engaging with individuals.
And our final panelist today is Dr. LR.
Hey, I'm Dr. LR, and sorry I'm a little bit late. I, in fact, was having a lab meeting that ran over a little bit. We're trying to submit some things to a national conference, and so we were going through our findings, trying to put them together in a way that we could submit. I'm relatively new to UNCC. I started a year and a half ago, but I have been in this sort of job for a long time. Actually across my career at 3 different institutions, University of Nebraska and Lincoln, and then the University of South Alabama and here. And I have been on the admissions committees for graduate students for all those different places. So I think I have some perspective on what people are looking for from when you're applying to graduate school. My labs traditionally contain a mix of doctoral, master's, and undergraduate students, which I think is you're hearing from everybody. Undergrad is probably right now the least represented. I'm a little top heavy with doctoral students, and so it makes it hard to have the full array, but I think I have total 4 or 5 undergraduate students or just post-bac students. And one of the reasons why there's some post-bac students in my lab is that they didn't realize till they were really far along how important it is to be part of the research endeavor, regardless of whether you're going to take a more clinical path or applied path or an experimental or kind of professorial or even a business like industry path. That research component of your psychology experience actually is one of the things that really separates you from the standard undergraduate psychology major. And there are a lot of undergraduate psychology majors, so you do need some things that are really going to help you stand out from the rest. And that's true. The research really helps with that on the applied side as well as on the research side. So I do have some post-bac students from UNCC who kind of got that a little bit later in the game and now are coming back for 1 year of research or 2 years of research before trying to go on to grad school. And that's another pathway that actually works pretty well for people to get the experience they need before they're going to apply to a doctoral student program.
All right, so now that you've heard a little bit about the background of our panelists, we'll go ahead and get right into our first question. So our first question is, how important are test scores and GPA? And related to that, what can I do if I have low GPA or test scores?
I'll take this one first, and y'all can take a different one first. Relatively high GPA, I think, is actually pretty important because it says that you're negotiating the day-to-day demands of being a student and doing it well. There's also quite a bit of grade inflation going around across the country, so a low GPA is harder to understand in the context when there's pretty high GPAs and we got 170 to 200 applicants to the HP program, you're going to want to look in the top group. The GPA is going to help you with that. There are, of course, extenuating circumstances where people have a really rough transition to college, or they have mono during a semester, or they have, things happen. And we completely understand that. And if that's explained by you and your letter writers in a decent way, that's probably the best you can do, is to have 7 other solid semesters and explain the 1 semester or the 2 semesters, however it was, or come back and do another year undergrad where you get all A's because you're now focused in a different way than you were before. So there's plenty of ways to kind of overcome that. But it is something that you need to think about and really plan for and strategize about, in my opinion. The GRE is actually a national conversation with lots of programs now kind of debating whether they want to use it at all. So that's probably a whole panel discussion on the GRE. I think it's harder to really substantially change your GRE because we know that a lot of it's based on your early experiences with your family reading to you, and some people's families didn't have that luxury or that opportunity. So I think you can do more on the math side than you can on maybe the verbal side in terms of changing it. But if you're going to do the GRE, you should practice for it. You should probably invest, if it's needed for where you want to go, you should probably invest in doing one of the courses because they've been shown to improve your scores, and just do the best you can. And again, if you have a deficit there, that's something that maybe you should have somebody speak to and explain and think about.
I would agree on the national conversation on test scores, because that really is sort of an evolving piece as they've done more research on how predictive they are. They can be really helpful for, as you sort of say, like, okay, if you're looking for like you have a lot of applicants and it's too many to consider, but that is those are that's that can happen in some at some schools. And I think there's a larger, now there's a much more of a shift to basically doing more comprehensive evaluation where you're figuring out how to balance across all of the indicators. So the range of indicators is GPA, test scores, letters of recommendation, personal statement, prior education and experiences. So there's we have applicants that have, chosen very specific professional jobs that are in line with some of their interests, and those extended employment at those places, just can be a positive indicator. I mean, in the end, grad school takes a lot of perseverance and dedication, but those things oftentimes, more than most anything else. When some people have asked me sort of just over my career at times of like, wow, you must be really smart for having gone through the professor. It's like, actually, my response is no, you have to just really keep on going, and you just have to really sort of persevere because it's very independent. And so a lot of graduate school in terms of research, and even if you're going the clinical route, is really training in terms of how to be a clinician that can function independently and how to be a researcher that can function independently. And so we need to look for some of those indicators, or look for evidence of that sort of dedication and perseverance in the various indicators in your application. And GPA and test scores are, a part of that. I think I would probably value GPA a bit more than test scores in terms of what I look for I can get a little bit more information in terms of which classes a student does well in. It also gives me an idea the types of classes that they take, what their interests are, and I can see sort of how students' interests have potentially evolved. And this adds sort of a broader context to their personal statement and letters of recommendation and the actual just GPA itself.
I was going to agree with my colleagues, and in terms of cases where your test scores might be low in specific subjects, I would seek to contextualize those in your coursework, right? So you may have, for example, a low quantitative score, but if you can counteract for that by the coursework you've done in quantitative courses, that would kind of might assuage the committee's concerns in that area. Or if you have a low verbal score, but you have strong writing materials, and the letters of recommendation indicate that you have great competencies in communication and writing, again, that would be a way to kind of mitigate those concerns. But going back to Dr. Levens' point about independence, I think to cultivate that independence, and Dr. LR's point about her post-bac students, you do need some time to be able to develop that independent research identity. So you either need to identify your interest in research early and jump onto that as soon as possible, or devote some time, maybe post-bac, to develop those skills, but also your relationship with your mentors, who will be your letter writers, who can put your career trajectory thus far in context.
I'd like to add something real fast if I can, just because this might be one of the points to add this, because when you're going through and preparing for graduate school, there's this idea of like trajectory. Like, okay, here's the path. Like, okay, you go through this, you get this GPA, you do these test scores, and then you move on in here. And one of the things that I tell students at every opportunity, and I know that my colleagues do as well, there's no set trajectory, there's no set path. The only goal is for you to figure out, like what you're interested in doing for your life. And so if that takes extra time, if that means that you want to take some time off after undergraduate, do a gap year, like do it, it takes a lot of time investment. And so graduate school, so you don't want to do it unless this is what you know that you want to do, if it's really the stepping stone that you need. And so that's a really big thing, is just take the time to when you're in school, this is when you should be getting all the information that you can to figure out what is best for you. And this students will oftentimes express concern that like, oh, I didn't want to sort of tell someone this. I had a student that basically had applied and gotten into med school and freaked out at the last minute because she figured out that she didn't want to go. And she was really nervous about telling her parents. And when she'd come to to meet with me, it was like, wait, this is your life, so just like, remember, this is this is your life. So that's one of the things, is like I don't know if this took us on track, but it's really important to have that sort of space for yourself. And GPA and test scores are very sort of like, okay, this is the thing that I have to do to get me there. There's they're really formulaic, but we also look for people that have diverse experiences, and you can tell from applicants when they're really passionate. So give yourself the time and space to get the range of experiences that you would need to like figure out what you want to do and to really be passionate about something.
The only thing that I would add that hasn't been said yet is that master's level programs and PhD level programs have differing values of weighting these. So one thing to consider is if there was a portion of your undergrad where you maybe weren't as focused, that you do a master's to show that that was in your past and that you have focus and more trajectory, like others have talked about. That is one thing just to keep in your radar. But also, I think I just want to reiterate that if you do have this blip or something that doesn't look quite as strong, that you make sure your letter writers are aware and that they contextualize it. Otherwise, it's you, if they write a really glowing letter about you and your abilities in the lab, but then you have this kind of potential tarnish or like question mark on your total package and they're not aware, that will really look like there's not communication going on, and you don't want that because you want to be able to put forth your best package. And I only know this because I had a student do that for me, lack of communicating their GRE scores. And if she would have told me that that was it, we could have talked about it. And it turned out she had a concussion the day before she took it. So of course her GRE scores are going to be awful. If you've ever had a concussion, you know your brain doesn't function very well after it. But I didn't say that in the letter, and I could have told them that and let them know that that was not indicative of her performance and her future studies. So you got to just be really open, even if it's something that you feel like is not good about you or strong about you. You have to be open to your letter writer so that they can really help contextualize things.
I also want to pick up on something that you were saying about master's and doctoral programs having different, maybe criteria, but also the different types of graduate programs. And even within graduate programs, like within clinical programs, there are some programs that'll say in their materials, we won't consider you unless your GRE scores are this. They mean that. So if your GRE scores aren't that, then you don't want to spend $60, $70 applying to a place that's not going to read your application. So you also have to have a really good appraisal, and it helps if you can take all of your package to your advisor and say, these are my GRE scores, these are my grades, this is what I want to do. Am I a strong candidate, and to which schools and to which place? Because there's no sense like spending a bunch of money and time and effort on something where they won't even look at your materials.
Thank you all so much for that. We did have one question in chat. Do our psychology GPAs matter, or are only our overall GPAs being judged? Dr. LR had already responded in the chat. Her response was both. We like to see if you have taken a rigorous course load overall and how you have done in science courses and juggling a hard array of experiences. Does anyone else have anything else they would like to add about that?
I think it might differ a little bit on field of study. So like our response might be different from someone in engineering. So that's one piece just to know. There's other pieces, and again, it also depends on the type of program that you're applying for. So for our doctoral program, we actually value, it's an interdisciplinary program. So we will actually look for evidence that the applicant has taken courses outside of psychology, because we want to have some of that sort of breadth of experience. So that so it very much depends upon the program.
And we had one other question. If I take a gap year between undergraduate and applying for graduate school, will working/volunteering in my field of study increase my chances of being accepted when I apply eventually?
I would say, yeah. More experience. I mean, it's, like more experience is beneficial. It's like, it's the key word is sort of elements of in your field of study and things that you can talk about. You now have professional experience, as my daughter says, IRL, in real life experience. And so these are, then you'll be able to talk about how you might have potentially even applied some of your coursework in your field of study to, your volunteer work in, like a professional or volunteer capacity. So you'll actually be able to demonstrate aspects of application and be able to talk a little bit more in depth.
All right, thank you so much. So we'll go on to our next question. So our next question, we kind of talked a little bit about applications already, but what parts of an application do you look at and what is most important?
I'll jump in first. So I look at the whole application. That's a real thing, and try to look at every piece of it. But when I'm really looking at a candidate, I am looking for fit. So I think everybody's kind of talked about this a little bit, and everyone can chime in about what they see as fit. But graduate training is either at master's or PhD level, it doesn't matter. It's not like undergraduate. So it's not like, oh, I'm above threshold, I got in, I can do this. It's, you have to be above threshold, you have to be good enough, but then you also have to match in the future advisor mentor relationship. Because if they can't see how you can be fitting into their lab, then they're just not going to be able to make that happen. So that sounds almost impossible, right? Because you have no idea what that person's mind is looking for specifically. So what you have to do is just communicate clearly what your interests are and how you see your role in their lab, and their lab is in your future trajectory, so your future career. And if you can convey that in the written format, that is going to be your best chance at catching the eye of a future graduate mentor. So I think the essay is really important. And then the letters have to support that kind of idea that you're ready for graduate school. So I think that's those are the two probably highest important things. I'm going to stop there and let others chime in.
Yeah. For me, I'll just, everybody's going to have probably a slightly different process, but for me, I'll kind of skim through some of the pieces, sort of take in elements of the GPA, but I actually really go like first in depth to the personal statement and to the letters, because that's where I feel like I get to know the person a little bit. And so then I kind of take that in and I was like, okay, as Dr. Bennett was saying, parts of their interest, how have they done some of their homework in terms of how they would match with me. So building off of what Dr. LR said earlier about like doing your homework on your schools, and don't apply if your GRE is here, and it's not where it needs to be. You don't just apply to a ton of schools and hope that you hit one. You really want to actually be doing sort of targeted applications, thinking about what you want to be doing, looking into the programs and the faculty that are going to get you there. This idea that the fit is really, really big. And this may be different for certain types of master's programs, because not all master's programs have a mentorship model. They'll have them sort of all admitted as a class. But our master's and doctoral programs all have a mentorship model. So that's one of the things to kind of find out, because how you would present yourself would actually be really different for master's work that has a mentorship model and master's students that are admitted as sort of a cohort. And you can ask them that question, because if you're admitted to a cohort, then a lot of it is just sort of like, hey, you're trying to communicate different things in terms of like skills, how you're going to be a valuable sort of contributor to the program and to the cohort, and that you kind of that you don't have just the basics, you have a little bit more than the basics, and then you don't necessarily have to be mindful of like a fit with a faculty member. But if we but for programs that are fit based, with that strong mentorship model, if you have identified a faculty member but you haven't done your homework, or even like, you're saying, hey, I want to work with this person, and they're not accepting applicants that year, then you won't be considered. They're not going to necessarily, like, if they say I'm not accepting applicants, then they generally will not. And you've then put in this time. So really do your homework, reach out to the faculty member. That goes a long way in terms of asking them like, look, I've looked on your website, I've read, I've looked at some of your articles recently. I'd love to hear about some of your recent projects that you're doing, because oftentimes, articles that are being published sometimes happen a couple of years afterwards. Research takes time. So something that was published this year might have been data that was collected 2 to 3 years ago. So you want to find out what's going to be going on while you're going to be there, not what has been going on. And then, so really put in the time. And it goes a really long way if I can tell when I'm looking at someone's personal statement that they've actually done their homework, and they say, oh, if they say something like, I really want to, look at behavioral genetics, that's something that I did as a postdoc, like before I even came here. So that's automatically not going to be, on my list of something that I would consider. So it's really do your homework and think about who you'd want to work with, how you'd fit with them. And then I think most professors, actually say what's a little bit different. Maybe some of my colleagues can comment on whether they prefer getting not sort of cold calls, but cold emails in terms of like how much I'd like to meet with you during a in preparation if you're accepting students and all that kind of stuff. So some faculty are very willing to do that. And if that's the case, I would definitely recommend taking them up on that offer. That like the half an hour of time or whatever is going to be really, really well worth it.
So the thing as a student that you probably can't really know is that faculty vary in terms of the number of applicants they get coming to want to work with them. And also between programs, there are differences in some programs get maybe 150 applicants for 5 spots, and some programs get 10 applicants for 3 spots, right? So partly, if you're going for a clinical psychology PhD program, you're probably going to be competing with 150-ish other people for 5-ish spots. So the match becomes really important. And also at the same time, the people you're trying to match with are juggling a lot. So for me personally, I have a fair number of students that reach out beforehand to ask, A, are you taking any students this year? And B, this is what I'm interested in. Are you interested? Is that a match with you, current match? And usually they try to highlight one article or 2 articles that I've recently published that they think make them a match for me. I keep all of those in a spreadsheet. So when I get the applications, I go back to those people who've already reached out to me, and I highlight that I for sure need to read and pay close attention to their application. So although I don't have that hour meeting with each of those people, because they may or may not end up applying to the program, and I don't have really time to do applications before it's time to do applications, I will send an email back saying, thank you for my interest. I do see you as a fit, or I don't, or this work is happening, or this isn't. So I'll send an email back that, or I am taking a student or I'm not. So that piece I really think is an important part of the application process.
And also that another dimension for why professors may not want to, for example, meet with you prior to reviewing applications is in terms of equity, because there may be differences in terms of who's socialized to know that they need to reach out to professors versus not. So that I know that at least some professors may decline to chat with you ahead of time until it's time to review applicants, and then once you're shortlisted and it's time for interviews, then you go through the normal channels of the process. And I just want to echo what everyone else has said in terms of the importance of the personal statement for fit-based programs and how it's the one element that can actually make or break your application. You may be a stellar candidate with perfect GRE scores and GPA, but if there's a discrepancy in terms of your research interests and the faculty members you're identifying as potential mentors, then you may not be then shortlisted for the next step of the process on those grounds. So maybe in terms of selecting then the programs that you're applying to, it's not a matter of simply identifying the top programs in your field, in social psychology or cognitive or clinical necessarily, but it should be guided by the fit in your and your mentors' research interests. And how that is achieved in terms of figuring out fit, ideally, the leading scholars in the area in which you're interested based on whatever independent research project you've been working on so far, or your own readings. And so that's an important step of the process in terms of identifying faculty members and programs to apply to. And as I think Dr. Levens mentioned, it's important to figure out what's currently happening in one's lab, right? So as a heuristic, what you might do is you might, obviously going to the faculty member's website is quite important first step. Those websites may or may not be up to date a lot of the time. Sometimes we lag a little behind in terms of updating our websites. We may not indicate whether we're taking students this year or not. Sometimes we do, but not everybody does. So reaching out is one important step to figure that out if it's not listed on the program level or the faculty member's website. And then in terms of what is ongoing work, look at the websites of the faculty members. You can go to their Google Scholar and list the publications by date and see what are some of their most recent publications and whether these topics are still capturing your current research interests.
All right, thank you all so much for those responses. For the sake of time, we are going to go ahead and move on to the general question portion. So if you've got any general questions for any of our panelists, you can type them in the chat or unmute yourself and ask them. You can also ask if you just want some more information about anything or anything like that. All right, so we have a question in the chat from Asia. How many mentors do PhD students typically identify on their applications? And a couple people have already responded in the chat. Most of our faculty have said typically 1 to 3, but does anyone want to kind of expand on that or add anything else?
And the answer 1 to 3 is good, I think, in terms of number, but it also does matter which 3 you're choosing. So for example, there was an application in the last batch that we looked at that chose me and our clinical neuropsychology faculty, Dr. Demakis, and he and I don't typically do stuff together. We have fairly disparate, but I have published in clinical neuropsychology because my husband's a clinical neuropsychologist. So I wondered what the students saw that made them see us together. So one good thing is if you're choosing 3 people or 2 people is to say, I'm really interested in this person's work on this and this person's work on this, and I see myself as in between that. We just accepted a student who did that between me and a faculty member who does a lot more applied work, because the applied work he does is with people who have sexual dysfunctions, and the interest they have is on my the things I do about sexual assault. And so the person nicely articulated how they would fit in this space, and we both saw the match. So again, it's you're trying to apply to it for the clinical people who are interested in clinical. You're trying to apply to enough programs to give yourself a shot, but not so many that you do it in this really generic way and nobody's interested. So what's that ideal number that you can manage? To me, it's probably about 10. Like any more than 10, you're probably not able to like do the research and really get the right framing. But underneath that, depending on, I mean, this year, a lot of programs didn't even take people, I guess, and there's some funding issues. So, you know, and then you have to decide, if I don't get in a clinical psychology PhD program, do I want to apply to master's programs and up my chances for the next round? Or do I want to think about, if I'm really very applied and my weakness is that I'm not super interested in research, do I want to go to a master's in social work or become a marriage and family therapist, or really take on a degree that has that really strong applied flavor, whereas clinical psychology is always balancing the applied and the research.
Yeah, I think really good points that Dr. Lara just mentioned. And just because I have a student that I just kind of guided through this process, she had a very specific narrow area that she wanted to work in and get trained in for her clinical psych degree. And she spent probably 8 months doing the research to figure out where were those programs, who she needed to apply, who she needed to connect with. So this is not something you can do in a very short window of time if you want to be successful in really navigating this space. So she spent a year post-bac with me, actually 2 years now, because she's going to start in fall of this coming fall somewhere. And it was her top choice place, but she put time and effort. It's a research project in and of itself to find the right programs to capture what training you want. So I think that's another thing to be really aware of, is that this is not something you can pull together very quickly. If you are looking to have a really competitive project or package, it's a years of work and planning. So if you're sitting there right now as a junior or a senior and you're like, I don't have it, and that's okay, you can build it, right? But you have to be patient with yourself and patient with the process, because otherwise you'll just waste a lot of money. And I talked with her about that. I was like, she was going to apply last time around. I was like, there's no point. You are not going to be competitive. And she didn't like that, but she now is much happier because she's going to our top school. So I think if you can get connected with a research mentor here now and figure out, how do I chart that course and save yourself money and heartache and time, that'll probably be the best thing for you.
I don't know how terrified you guys all are right now, because it's just like so many things to think about. But I'll put my contact information in the chat, so if anyone sort of has any questions for follow-up. It seems more overwhelming right now, but it's really just thinking about being really thoughtful about what you want to do, then trying to find the programs that are in line with that. And if you don't know what you want to do, like, it's okay to say, okay, I'm going to take some time to tell your parents, like, like the faculty at my school, and I attended this talk, they said we should not really apply unless we don't know completely, if that speaks to you. um, and Master's programs really do help you get into PhD programs. It really, like, if you've completed a master's and you're then moving on to the PhD, then you really know, it's like, okay, this is what the student wants, because they've been through sort of like the initial round, so to speak. And so don't so so if you're not completely sure, do a master's first. And do even a master's that maybe can be a little bit more, tailored, that you have some room to kind of like make it your own. Um, when you find some of the programs that you think would be a good fit, then look into sort of, okay, is it a fit sort of mentor model, or is it a cohort model? And then kind of, like adjust your application accordingly. If it's a fit model, then look into the mentors and just just break it down sort of step by step, and don't worry about that like if you're not supposed to have the answers when you start the process. And the while we hope that, especially with this helpful preparation, that you guys will, get in sort of the first time around, it doesn't always happen. And lots of times, actually, I would say most of the time, if you don't get in, it's not actually due to anything that was wrong with your application or wrong with you or anything like that. Um, and we had over 30 people for our interview day for HP, for our health psychology program. And I think, like we were, I think we gave out offers to like maybe 7 or 8 total across all the concentrations, maybe 9. And and uh, and that 33 was, from over 200 applicants. And any one of those, like there's so many people that would have done really, really well, but they, you know, there wasn't quite the level of fit that a faculty member was looking for. There, if there was a good fit, there was multiple people competing for a faculty member. That faculty member might not have had as much priority for, there's all sorts of reasons in terms of like, faculty members that have funding lines, that are able to admit students because they have grant funds or they have startup funds. And or they're prioritized because we're supporting junior faculty. So there's a whole range of things that are there's so much that's outside of your control. And so that's just a really important thing to highlight.
All right, so unfortunately that is all the time we have for tonight's session. Thank you so much to all our panelists for taking the time out of their day to come answer our questions. That will conclude tonight's session. Have a good night.